good evening everybody, and welcome to this event on this very warm Wednesday evening. My name is Hal Branch, and I'm one of the partners, you may have guessed from the name, at Branch Austin McCormick, otherwise known as BAM. First of all, I would like to say a very warm welcome to Lord Neuberger, and of course to Susan Lamb too. And also I wish to welcome the law students as well. You're very welcome to be with us today. I'd also like to thank One Essex Court and also the Anglo-Australasian Lawyers Society for organising this with us BAMers. So thank you very much for that. We are here to discuss freedom of speech, and at BAM we undertake a significant number of cases concerned with freedom of speech, not only concerned with defamation, but also with my colleague here, Elliot Hammer, in respect of freedom of speech to express views which are not always welcomed by others, and that can involve cases involving political parties such as the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. I did a quick Google search, being rather lazy, as to what freedom of speech means, and of course what Google tells us is that it's the foundation of democracy, and that it provides accountability and transparency and intellectual growth, together with creativity and innovation. And if that's not enough, it also apparently provides us with the courage to challenge, because freedom of speech emboldens us to challenge the status quo, question norms, and advocate for change. And apparently it gives the marginalised a greater voice, whether that's a good thing or not. I was going to tell a story about my experience of Twitter and the Solicitor's Regulation Authority, but I decided not to, for good reasons. But there are many ways, apart from Twitter and the SRA, where the English law entails freedom of speech. I had the privilege of being in Lord Neuberger's court, in the Court of Appeal, in a case concerning a very rich lady buying a very expensive house in Highgate. On that occasion, Lord Neuberger and I agreed, and the court found in my client's favour, proving that the Sunday Times can print what it wishes, but of course there can be consequences, as with all free speech perhaps. Finally, I suspect that all of us are in favour of free speech as a concept, but the issues are of course complex, and this is where rather conveniently I hand over to the panel. Thank you.
Just a minute. The welcome that I'm going to give is on behalf of the Anglo-Australasian Lawyers Society, which has organised this event tonight. So a huge thank you to Branch Austin McCormick for hosting. We were very pleased for them to join the Anglo-Australasian Lawyers Society this year as members. And with that, I think I would like to have a nice introduction. We are very honoured to host the Right Honourable Lord Neuberger of Abbotsbury this evening, past President of the UK Supreme Court, but many other accolades to his career, his very distinguished career, and interviewed by a friend of mine from the UN, Rhodes Scholar. She's got a quip about that as well, who most recently has been appointed to the Supreme Court of Belize. So she has some judicial background herself to discuss this, and a very strong background in freedom of speech. One other point is you've got flyers on your chairs, and there is the code there to if you through Oxford University Press for purchasing the book if you're interested. So we'll let it commence.
It was a pleasure to meet you, Lord Neuberger. It was also a complete pleasure to read your book, The Freedom of Speech in International Law, which was published in late 2023, and which is an incredibly rich and important distillation of the law and practice in a number of very significant areas. And I thought I might just get the ball rolling this evening to ask what prompted you to write this book at this time?
It was suggested to me by my co-editor, and really the editor who did significantly more work than I did, Amal Clooney, we came across each other in rather unusual circumstances, in that two Burmese journalists, Myanmar journalists, working for Reuters, were arrested and prosecuted and convicted of endangering national security in completely ridiculous circumstances. They had actually published information that was in an article that was publicly available, but the military was out to get them. It was a time when Aung San Suu Kyi was a sort of head of state. A, she wasn't officially because she couldn't be, but she was the moving force. But B, the military still controlled much of the government. And Reuters decided to try and persuade her, at least to pardon these journalists. And they got together a group of people who might have some influence. And Amal and I were among them. And we got to know each other. And she, who is also a practicing barrister, acts on international stage, teaches and writes, had written a book on the right to a fair trial, and was in the process of considering this book, and asked me if I would join her as editor, which I did. But as I say, I feel a bit of a fraud in the sense that she did more work than I did. I would say she was like the managing director, and I was more like the chairman. But at any rate, it is a book like, I can say, like almost anybody who writes a book on a significant topic or edits it. I learnt a great deal in writing it and editing it, and it was a pleasure to have done it.
Well, I too learned a lot about it, and I think you've touched on a couple of...
Could you hold the microphone closer?
I also learned a lot from reading it, and you've touched on a couple of interesting themes there. Firstly, I dare say Myanmar is not an enthusiastic signatory to many international human rights agreements, and yet the book identifies what you describe as an international norm around freedom of speech. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, and what was the motivation for that particular focus?
Well, I think that there had been no book that covered the international angle. And there are a number of genuinely international bodies, the United Nations in particular, and a number of significant regional organizations like the US, the African and the European Commission and Court, which do have a great deal of similarities. They have some differences, and we were concentrating on them. It's fair to say that as with saying the international opinion on the Ukraine war is in a certain direction, if you take a number of countries, including China, you don't have a universal consensus, and I'm sure you never will, but well, I very much doubt that you will. But there was sufficient degree of commonality and acceptance of general principles among a large number of countries to be able to say that there was some sort of international norm above and beyond jus cogens.
And once setting out that framework, the book is then divided into 4 thematic areas that includes insulting speech, hate speech, false speech, and speech affecting national security. And there I noticed that the approach shifts quite a lot and it becomes recommendations. Would it be fair to say that's because, is that where international consensus starts to break down on those 4 areas?
Yes, I mean, these are exceptions. I mean, the trouble with freedom of expression, unlike freedom from torture, is that it's not an absolute right. And in our first, if we studied law in our first term, in our first lecture, the example always given is you don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded building. And there obviously have to be restrictions on freedom of expression. And the big difficulty is that different countries, different cultures, different approaches inevitably mean that there will be some differences, sometimes of detail, sometimes of principle. The one that always struck me as was the Holocaust denial, for example, which in this country we would think is quite inappropriate to say it's is objectionable. You may disagree with it, but it's something somebody can say. But in countries where they underwent the Holocaust and millions of Jews were killed, you can understand why they're more sensitive about it. In some countries, we were in Southeast Asia a moment ago with Myanmar, in Burma, in Thailand, you cannot insult the king. And if you insult the king, you go to prison for 20 years. I think that to some extent that is a convenient protection for the government for clamping down on free speech. More to the point, in some countries you can be rude about Islam. In other countries it would lead to rioting and murders. So you do have to accept, even on that sort of elementary level, there are going to be some differences. But then there are more sort of principle differences, if you like, rather than factual differences, like the extent to which you would allow criminal prosecution for insulting speech. I mean, Europe, interestingly, is rather more tolerant towards allowing criminal proceedings than the American or indeed the United Nations approach. So I think there are these differences, and I think that we tended to be on the more liberal side in what we recommended.
You mentioned in the beginning that a very strong initial motivation for writing this book was the protection of journalists. I also learned from the book that a very strong risk that journalists face is the so-called weaponizing of legal systems through so-called slap suits, often in many different jurisdictions, and they're often baseless but very expensive to defend. And Daphne Galizia, at the time she was murdered, apparently faced more than 40 libel actions, and she described this as a form of institutionalized torture. Do you see any encouraging signs of progress on preventing this occurring?
I think we have to accept that since the 1990s, up to the 1990s, in a way, if you were a liberal human rights, person in favour of liberal human rights, the world was going in the right direction. I think since 1990 or possibly 2000, we're intending to go a bit in the wrong direction. I think there are two sorts of slaps. There's the government operated slaps, where national security and so on are used as an excuse for imprisoning journalists, or even worse, I'm afraid, sometimes. And then there are the slaps which we are more familiar with in this country, and I imagine in Australia and Canada, in fact I know in Australia and Canada and so on, where very rich people use the legal system and scare individual journalists, if they can, rather than newspapers which have the money, by really running up costs and using bogus defamation claims to shut down responsible and often very accurate journalism. I think it has to be dealt with it can be dealt with in two ways. One is through legislation, and in some countries it is being dealt with in that way. I think in some places in Australia and Canada it's being dealt with in that way. In Europe, I think in the EU there are directives, there's a draft directive, but it's also up to the judges to be robust. And I detect there's an interesting Irish judgment earlier this year, in April this year, which is quite robust. And I think judges are called upon to be robust in this area. And the difficulty always is taking a view on a case where you haven't got all the facts, you haven't had all the witnesses, you've only got some of the documents, and it's always the trouble that you will know. Making interlocutory decisions, you always think, I'm not sure I've seen everything, can I take a definite view? And if you're saying this is a slap claim that should be slapped down, it's a bit difficult to be confident, or you have to be pretty sure before you do it. And I think that's the difficulty. But I think we cannot let the legal system, so far as we can avoid it being used as a system of oppression to shut down responsible journalism or freedom of expression generally.
Indeed. Another, perhaps, risk in a similar area, and while all of us would accept that curtailment of freedom of speech in terms of national security and counter-terrorism and defence is necessary, this is also potentially subject to abuse. And we've of course had the recent development of the Julian Assange matter finally settling after a very long time. Are there any observations you would have on that general balance between the right to public access in the public interest as against those legitimate curtailments?
I think maybe I'm being too self-centered about this, but as a judge, it's particularly difficult when the government tells you that national security is at stake, for a judge to say, I don't believe you, I'm overruling you. But there are cases where a judge can, and in some exceptional cases should do that. But subject to that, I think that looking at it more broadly, governments have to be careful that merely because information that has got out is embarrassing, even if it's to do with defence or espionage, doesn't mean that it's an attack on national security. But just like any other litigant, governments can be quite good at deceiving themselves and not wickedly, but wrongly, insisting that something is a matter of national security when it isn't. We all know this human trait of wanting to believe what, and then believing what suits us rather than what is really the truth. And to that extent, I think there's enormous responsibility on government lawyers. And that's when you get to people like the Attorney General and the Solicitor General, and the very difficult position they have as, on the one hand, being part of the government, but on the other hand, telling truth to power. But in the end, the judges have to be prepared to stand up in appropriate cases and to dig. And the difficulty is in the common law system, judges are not paid to dig, they're paid to judge what comes in front of them. In the civil law system, they are more encouraged to dig. So maybe we have to consider, to some extent, changing our ways. But equally, we don't want to put the judiciary on an unnecessary collision course with the government, but part of their role is to call the government to account. And ultimately, that is where the buck has to stop when a decision is made on that score.
Would, in your view, that be assisted by more robust whistleblower protections, or is it something that you believe the judiciary already has the necessary tools to achieve?
So far as whistleblowers are concerned, I'm not better informed than anyone else in the room. But my impression is that we have law that protects whistleblowers, but you read an awful lot of stories where whistleblowers appear to be victimized for whistleblowing. The difficulty is, are they exceptions or exaggerated, or are they really the case? But as a matter of impression, I get the impression that whistleblowers are not given the protection generally that they should be given in practice and are intended to be given. Trouble is, of course, that my whistleblower is your nuisance troublemaker, and there will be people who anoint themselves as whistleblowers who are not. But the truth is that they do have to be protected, and I'm not sure, and we may have the legislation, but I'm not sure whether we, in practice, protect them enough. But as I say, that's based on impression more than solid information.
And this is, after all, a AALS event, and so I think it would be befitting of me to include an Antipodean example, and it does flow to some extent onto some of these more difficult national security questions. And the one I'm going to focus on is counter-terrorism and the mosque attack in New Zealand in 2019, which gave us the very worrying spectre of a terrorist incident being live streamed and for a mercifully brief moment broadcast to the world at large before it was taken down. The response to that was heartening to some extent. There was the so-called Christchurch call that tried to encourage collaboration across these issues. Do you think that's genuinely taken root and given us a better outcome than we would have had in 2019?
I'm not sure that I'm really competent to say, but it is an example of freedom of expression in the new world. No, I don't mean in New Zealand, Australia, I mean in the new world of communications, where you can record and share across the world events, good and bad, interesting and boring, happening as they occur, and show them to literally billions of people. And often, occasionally showing things that should not be shown, either for moral reasons or legal reasons, and by the time anyone knows about them, they've happened.
Yes,
and it does emphasize the power of words and the power of images, which always gets talked about and we're always aware of, but it is now far more extreme. But we all know that the internet has a very positive side and a very negative side.
It was, I know it was a watershed moment in New Zealand. It was a difficult issue, I think, for the reasons you described in terms of the immediate global broadcast of it, but even in the narrow confines of dealing with this material in an ordinary criminal and a coronarial case, it was of such a traumatizing nature that understandably judges were reluctant to show it for any reason at all. So I think we're in this very sort of brave new world, if you like, sort of governed by technology. I wonder if I could return to Myanmar, where we touched earlier, in the sense that the role that Facebook and social media played as a disseminator of some very virulent material that seemed to just surpass the capacity of moderators to take down. And frankly, even if they could, would that material be available for later criminal proceedings? And the book does deal very insightfully with that, and I wonder if you could elaborate on what this might mean for social media providers and other agencies.
Well, I mean, some social media providers don't take their role that seriously, in the sense of acting as censors. They don't think they should. Elon Musk and X, formerly Twitter, clearly has a very relaxed view, and I think he would be taking a more extreme view than he currently takes, or extreme position, if he didn't feel that it was going to harm his reputation and possibly Twitter. On the other hand, you have Meta, which does have officially controls that I think on the whole are genuinely meant and genuinely applied. One can be over naive about it, but I think they are genuinely applied. The big question, which American government is, I think, determined to block at the moment and therefore won't happen, is whether you say that all these organizations are in the same position as publishers of books. And if they choose to indulge in this business, they must take the consequences. And some bits of legislation are starting to move that way. Our Online Safety Act of last year places a great responsibility, and rightly, I think, on the providers, because that's where you can control. And if they are liable for what's going on there, I suspect they can control it. And maybe, unlike with publishers, you wouldn't have an absolute rule, but they would have to show that they have proper supervision and that they act very quickly. You probably couldn't, I'm not sufficiently informed about the details to know whether you could go further than that, but I would certainly have thought that it was hard to argue against that as a matter of principle.
Indeed, I think the challenge of dealing even with existing technologies is immense for all of the reasons you've indicated. What about future and emerging ones? Do you have any view on artificial intelligence, AI, and the risks that that may portend?
I think, well, in general, I think the big problem, particularly at the moment, is that the changes in IT and AI in the whole area of intelligence and communications are so quick, and so even taking people who are meant to be in the know and at the cutting edge by surprise, and are so surprising in their effect, the prospect of legislation dealing with it successfully, particularly when making of laws, whether in the legislature or in the courts, is a relatively slow, ponderous, considered matter, is a real problem. There's an enormous disconnect. And at the moment, it's a pathetic answer, but we can only do our best. But I do think it is a real problem. I think you can probably try and lay down some general principles. And with AI, that is where various organizations are going in laying down principles about what should be done. And I think that's the right way to set about it. If you start laying down detailed rules, you will find that the technology just makes the rules outdated. But if you have general principles, I think that is the best way to go.
Indeed. I guess the underlying phenomena is ascertaining what actually is reliable and what may be manipulated, which is troubling us on so many different levels. And of course, we've just gone through the pandemic, and we face this alarming spectre of what's often referred to as false speech, but of a risk that it's not only the usual consequence of reputational damage, but a risk to human health, and again with global reach. What are your reflections on what COVID-19 has taught us in these areas?
Well, I mean, false speech, as you say, if you libel or slander somebody, fair enough. But if you come away from that and you are peddling QAnon type stuff, that becomes much more difficult, because you can't say, you can only say true things on the internet. First of all, in some areas there is, in many areas, there are genuine differences of opinion about what the truth is. Secondly, many points are not matters of fact, but matters of opinion. And thirdly, part of freedom of expression is the freedom to be wrong. So the moment you get into false speech, if it's purely false, I don't think that can possibly justify any sort of retribution or criticism. But it's when it starts to do damage. And then that, of course, that is a matter of judgment as to whether it's doing damage. And secondly, if it does a little bit of damage, then that's a price worth paying for freedom of expression. So it is quite nuanced and quite difficult to assess. Thirdly, if it is speech that's harmful and does damage and is false, is it enough that that is the case to make it unacceptable, even criminal? Or do you have to have some sort of guilty mind, some sort of intention to do harm? Do you have to know it's false? And there, again, there's a difference in different systems about what's actually required. There probably isn't a perfect answer. In fact, I'm sure there isn't. And sometimes it may depend on how bad the falsity is and how harmful it is. I mean, obviously, if you're saying harmful things that incite violence, if you're saying that incite racial prejudice and so on, that's easy. But if you're causing scares about vaccinations, that's when it gets more difficult.
Indeed. I think you've treated us to a veritable tour de force of how norms can differ in different areas and from differing perspectives look very different. Returning to you perhaps a bit more personally, you're now retired from the UK Supreme Court, and you're now a Justice of the highest court of Hong Kong. Tell us a bit about that experience and how that has shaped your approach and your views on these issues or any other that you may wish to share.
when Hong Kong was handed back to China, part of the arrangement was that there would be a new top court. Like Australia and New Zealand, originally appeals from Hong Kong went to the Privy Council in London. Like Australia and New Zealand, when they became independent, that was inappropriate. And therefore, a top court was formed in Hong Kong, consisting of 4 local judges, the 4 most senior judges. And part of the arrangement was that a UK retired judge, or indeed 2 serving UK judges, would sit there periodically. This then expanded, and now a number of Australian retired judges sit there. That was fine. I started in 2010, but then following rioting and so on, the Chinese famously moved into Hong Kong and imposed some national security laws, which by our standards in the West are inappropriately savage and cut down freedom of speech to a very substantial extent. And this means that one does feel slightly concerned about being part of the judicial system in Hong Kong. And my colleague Jonathan Sumption and Lawrence Collins recently resigned because they felt that that was unacceptable. There are 2 views. 2 senior retired Australian judges actually joined the Court of Final Appeal in the past 18 months. My feeling is that I understand the concerns. I believe that the judges in the top court that I know very well, I've worked with them for years, are fine lawyers, they're independent, and they are doing their best to give judgments and according to the common law as we would understand it. And I feel that to leave them in the lurch when times are difficult, which I accept they are, is not the right thing to do. I also feel that I wouldn't do any good by leaving, and I also feel that I probably am helping support the rule of law, because it does exist in many respects in Hong Kong, although not as we understand it in relation to national security. I feel I am supporting rather than undermining the rule of law, but I accept it's not easy. It's fair to say, ironically, that a number of senior former judges in this country sit in Singapore, indeed I sit in Singapore, sit in Dubai, sit in Kazakhstan, sit in Qatar. And if you look at the World Freedom Index, some of those countries actually come lower than Hong Kong. And I think we feel that we are helping rather than undermining the rule of law by being there. But I accept there are 2 views.
As a former international criminal lawyer, I can definitely share some of those apprehensions, and also the desire that through engagement, it's perhaps this is where the where change may ultimately come. And this book is exactly all about that. It's, I think, by grappling with some of these really difficult issues on which disagreement is almost inevitable, sometimes fundamentally, sometimes more on detail. And this is a really extraordinary piece of scholarship, and we were all immensely enriched by it. I think the material that we've been able to canvass today has been very, very far-reaching, and I am sure that there are many, many questions that the audience would are probably itching to ask. And so at this point I would like to simply thank you, Lord Neuberger, for your engagement, and to open the floor to a Q&A.
You talked about freedom of speech in terms of lying, fake statements, false news, fake news. And I think I got your view, I think I understood your view to say that, you know, you can't really punish that if it's not really causing too much damage. I want to ask if that, I'd like to ask, thanks Julius, I'd like to ask if that sort of theoretical position you would hold to that theoretical position if, in decades to come, it led to more and more violence. I'm thinking about I'll think about a fictitious example of a gentleman in a different country claiming to win an election when perhaps he didn't, and actually commit to power as a result of that lie. Would your theoretical position still hold?
I feel passionately supportive of human rights as we see them, and of freedom of expression in particular. But I'm speaking in the 21st century, and I'm conscious, interested in history. If you go back to 400 years ago, 450 years ago, the reign of the previous Queen Elizabeth, virtually every human right that we now take for granted would have been laughed at by the government. Freedom of religion, freedom to marry, freedom of expression, even freedom from torture. The government was in the business of preventing all those. So I think it's unduly arrogant to suggest that any rights we talk about today are timeless. It's not to undermine them or to undervalue them, they are vital today. But I think things could change. I hope they don't in this connection. But if statements lead to violence, that's when you start to say that they're not free to be made. It's easy when somebody gets up in a crowd and incites people to smash up a mosque or attack a group of immigrants or anything like that. It's more difficult when the person isn't actually telling people to do it, but they do it. And I suppose what you can say is that if you take my example of Holocaust denial, in this country it would seem quite wrong to make Holocaust denial an offence. But if, as a matter of course, every time somebody got up and denied the Holocaust, people burnt down synagogues, you might then start to say that Holocaust denial should be an offence. I think the example you've given of an unnamed former American president is a very telling one, because that adds another factor into the equation which I find very difficult, which is when the law meets politics, and using the courts to attack a political opponent is something which I think brings the law into disrepute. And while I am no supporter of Mr. Trump, I'm not comfortable about the way the legal system is used to attack him. I don't think it does the legal system any good. The American legal system, at least what I read about it at the moment, has enough problems as it is. But I think your point is a good one. We have to judge these things by reference to reality as it is, where we exist at the present time, and things can change, and you have to change with them. The government has a duty to uphold the rule of law, to protect people, and the time comes, and it's acknowledged in any convention or treaty which respects and lays down the freedom of expression, it is a qualified right. And if it leads to violence and worse, then you have to do something about it.
Thank you, Lord Neuberger. My name is Elliot. I'm a partner at Branch Alston McCormick, and my practice is employment law. My question is in relation to protected beliefs. So there was a recent case where anti-Zionist beliefs were afforded protection, and we have the recent, or maybe not so recent now, gender critical beliefs were afforded protection. So in 2019 they were not protected, there was a judgment saying they wouldn't be protected, but then in 21 that was changed. Do you think we have a problem in relation to freedom of speech where you have judges which are purposely kept away from political considerations, are effectively compiling a list of what is allowed to be thought and said, rather than society as a whole making that decision?
I think the point about judges getting involved in politics is a very good one. I think part of the problem in America is that the judges have sufficient political power for the politicians to get interested and involved in their appointment, and therefore they get appointed for their political beliefs. And you then have the unfortunate spiral, as I see it, downward spiral that you got in the Supreme Court. Here we've managed to avoid it by, until the 1970s, the judges were asleep really so far as any policy was concerned. Judicial review then started to become more and more important. Then you had the Human Rights Act, and judges have undoubtedly become more political, not in the sense of party political, but policy political. You're absolutely right. And I think that actually when it comes to protected characteristics or protected beliefs, that is something for Parliament and not for the judges. And it should be for Parliament and not for the judges. And one of the problems sometimes is that the politicians are actually happier to leave it to the judges because A, they can not then don't get blamed for the decision, and B, they can always interfere if they're not happy. They can suck it and see. But I think that it should be the Parliament that does it. The problem is that when Parliament does it, particularly if you've got polarised politics, the protected characteristics and beliefs tend to be chosen not by reference to any sort of principle, but by reference to one's own personal politics. And judges, historically in this country, have been very good at not letting their personal politics interfere with their judgments, largely because we don't have a tradition of political judges. But in principle, I think your point is a good one. It should be Parliament, not the judges.
Hello, my name is Rob. I'm an antitrust competition lawyer by background. So adjacent to privacy and information and speech and that sort of thing. I have a question from ignorance about the international law on the freedom of expression in one element, which is to what extent do category rules matter? And a little bit of context to that, I studied in the United States and they have a bit of a different approach to freedom of expression, at least in libel, because what matters is who you are as much as what you say. The New York Times and Sullivan set down sort of a category rule where essentially the putative claimant or complainant, their status matters as much, if not more, as the particular context. And Americans would say our defense of freedom of expression is weak because it's fully contextual. In sort of the Ahern and Defamation Act context, a High Court judge gets to sort of weigh everything up and there's no certainty. In America, if you're a public figure or if you're talking about things of public importance, your right to curtailed freedom of speech must survive. And I'm just curious, is that sort of idea that maybe being a journalist or being a public figure is as much important as the particular context or content of speech? Does that have any wider is that sort of valued by other issues?
I think on the whole, in terms of defamation, no. In terms of privacy, yes. I mean, in the famous Naomi Campbell case, she was photographed entering a drug rehabilitation unit, and the argument was that it was an invasion of her privacy. It was held that the information that she was attending a drug rehabilitation unit, which would have been if it had been you or me, maybe not if I was Supreme Court President, but anyway, if it had been you would have been an invasion of your privacy. But the photograph was held to be unnecessary invasion of privacy and was held to be not allowed. But the reason it was held to be an invasion of a justified invasion of her privacy, to say that she was offending rehabilitation, was that she had said publicly that she wasn't. So it wasn't because she was a public figure that it was all right to tell the story, which it might have been in America. It was because she had denied it, and this was putting forward the truth. So the circumstances do matter. But I think when it comes to defamation, which is what you're talking about, the rule is the same for everybody. Indeed, if you're well known, the damages might be greater.
America, exceptional, not for the first time.
My name is Nicholas Lavender. I'm a High Court judge. I occasionally hear media and communications cases. I don't want to ask you about a hypothetical case, but a real case. What are your reflections on events in Southport this week, where we had a horrendous crime, followed by what the press are presenting as false statements, followed by violence in the streets?
Well, we talk a lot about responsible journalism, don't we? And of course, I don't know any more than I've read in the newspapers at the time and since, but I would have thought that there is a case for questioning whether newspapers have an extra responsibility. On the whole, we've tended to shy away from that. But when it comes to this sort of story, I can see an argument. I wouldn't like to go so far to say that I favour it, but I can see an argument for saying that if you have the benefit of being a large public an organisation that makes a lot of money out of circulating news, you do have a responsibility not to spread information which, even on cursory examination, you could see was A, false, and B, potentially going to be quite damaging. So rather weedily, I would say that seems to me to be worth looking into. I mean, you have a better view than me, frankly, if you sit on these cases. Let me bounce the question back to you.
Well, I think the problem is the one you referred to earlier, that actually it's not so much the newspapers, but there's information spreading on social media, and the ability to control that is much more.
Yes, I think social media was described years ago as sort of Wild West, and it remains that. And I don't think anyone's quite worked out what to do about it. That's certainly true. Well, the Chinese have worked out what to do about it.
Well, I am Julius Brookman, roving mine, but I'm about to actually summarise a few marks as to how the evening's going to progress. But I'm a family law partner here at Branchos. I did just want to ask you one question, particularly, generally speaking, it's a bit of a bleak scene with freedom of expression around the world. Do you see many countries where it's improving and the rule of law and civil liberties seem to be getting better in your experience?
I'm not an expert on across the world, but you're quite right. As I've said, and as you've said, over the past 20 years, things generally across the world have got worse. But if you were standing in 1990, everyone was saying how things were getting better. You had the famous end of history, democracy was taking over, everybody was becoming more liberal. Nobody thought that 20 years later we'd be talking about everything going bad. And maybe, just as things seem to be darkening now and don't seem to be getting better, maybe it's the converse of 1990. Things will get better because they tend to go in phases, they never go all in one direction. All we can do is in places where we have influence, where we have power, to do our best to make things work, to cling to our principles, and to accept that sometimes we have to cut down rights which are fundamental in order to protect society and in order to keep respect for those rights.
On a related topic, so not quite freedom of speech, but the right to protest. in light of recent events, you don't need to comment on them, but do you think we have balanced rights in relation to the right to protest?
I think that the recent amendments, there were statutory amendments to the right to protest, and then there were some amendments made by statutory instrument, secondary legislation, of a sort which most people who believe in the rule of law disapprove of, which was under so-called Henry VIII clauses, which enable ministers to change statutes. And the reason they can do that is because Parliament in the statute has said ministers can change what the statute says. And this is something which I hope the present government doesn't follow the previous government in doing a lot of. The recent changes effected by statutory instrument were held to be invalid by the High Court. The government appealed. There was a change of government, as we all know, and the present government has not exactly dropped the appeal, but is proposing to reformulate the law. I haven't studied the law very carefully, but I do think it is not very well drafted, and it's vital, particularly when you have curtailments on the right of freedom of expression, which extends to freedom to demonstrate and freedom to process, vital that any restrictions are A, kept to a minimum, and B, are absolutely clear. And to my mind, the amendments made both in the statute and in the statutory instrument that was quashed satisfy neither test. So yes, I agree with what you say, or what you imply.
Do you have gifts to each of the speakers which I'll bring up in a minute? So it's Julius Brooklyn, one of the partners from Rochester McCormick. Just want to say thank you very much. Just so you know how the night's going to go, one thing we do very well at Rochester McCormick is very good hospitality. Because of the hot weather, tragically, we're under quite a few of the RSVPs, so there's lots of food and drink. Please do stay. Just to give you a bit of a waymarker for the rest of the evening, we're here and we've got this about sort of 9 p.m. After 9 p.m, we hopefully have an area in the pub down one hidden street. So do stay for as long as everyone feels they would like to. And thank you very much to our speakers.
Here we go. He's got one more thing.
Thanks, Ron.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you. We've been delighted to be able to welcome you here tonight. And please stay on. So.
I try not to produce too much hot air.